Welcome to Creating a Family, talk about adoption and foster care. I'm Dawn Davenport. I am the host of this show as well as the director of the nonprofit creatingafamily.org. Today we're going to be talking with David Ambrose. He is the author of a book called A Place Called Home. He was a former homeless person, former homeless child, a former foster youth. And as I said, he is the author of a new book, A Place Called Home. Welcome, David Ambrose, to Creating a Family.
Well, thank you very much. I don't have either of those characteristics in my Tinder profile, but both are true. Both are true.
You are also a national poverty and child welfare expert and an advocate. You were recognized by President Obama, as an American champion of change, which I am giving you an applause right here. You are currently serving as the head of Community Engagement West for Amazon, and you previously led corporate social responsibility for Walt Disney Television, and you've served as president of the Los Angeles City Planning Commission, as well as the California Child Welfare Council, or you are a member of the California Child Welfare Council.
You swiped left and you made a choice.
There you go. I
appreciate that.
Okay, you need to be adding all of this to your Tinder profile, and then throw in a graduate of Vassar, and then, all right, just to top it all off, put in a JD from law degree from UCLA Law. So, I mean, really, everybody's going to be swiping right on you on this one.
Thank you, counselor.
Yeah. I loved the book, A Place Called Home. It is a memoir. I loved it. It was a hard read, but it also was bizarrely inspirational. I mean, because it was hard.
Yeah.
And we're going to be talking about the book, but also about your life, but also about, quite frankly, your courage and your resilience. And our audience is predominantly foster parents, adoptive parents, and professionals. So I think we have a lot to learn from you. I thought it would help to start, kind of separate it, because you had time with extreme poverty and homelessness when you were living with your mom, and then you had time in foster care. So I think that the issues are, some of them the same, some of them quite different. So I thought we would separate those times of your life. First of all, start off telling us your story, how you became homeless, how you entered into foster care, and just give us the background.
Yeah, well, thank you for the intro and sharing kind of the things I've done. And the journey to get there is as interesting as many of your listeners have encountered in their own important work. I was born into homelessness. There was no before time. There was no fall from grace. There was just, you're homeless. And from my earliest memories, it was moving from place to place, bus stations and subway stations and parks and shelters and churches and outdoors all over New York City and surrounding areas. And we just were consistently and constantly mobile. And by the we, it's me, my brother, my sister, all of us within a year of each other.
Yeah, so you were the youngest, and you had, and all three, it was your brother, your sister, then you, and all three within 3 years of each other.
Yeah, and my mom, and that was it. And my mom has and had and still has a progressive mental illness, kind of a laundry list. Mm-hmm. And we just live in a society that does not respect, treat, or elevate or help families like mine or women like my mom. So we went from one crisis situation to another. I start the book sharing a story. It was one of my motivating factors for writing the book. In Los Angeles, in many places, there's a homelessness crisis. And I don't know that it's more. I think it's just more visible. But I share the first story because so much of the dialogue has been about cleaning it up. Uh-huh. And I have been very offended by the it of it all. We dehumanize a whole people, my people. Mm-hmm. And I recall very distinctly one of my first memories was being swept out of Grand Central where we were sleeping. I was about 4. And we were put on the street and we almost died from exposure. It was very much the first time I thought we might die, although I didn't have the words at the time. And so I wanted to share my story because I think we can solve it. I think we've made progress. But I think the way that we do that is inspiring each other by nourishing each other with love and support. And I also wanted people to stop this constant chasing of Frankenstein. And by that, I mean all the people involved in the system, poverty, foster care, what have you, are just consistently denigrated by the larger public. And I wanted to humanize all of us that are part of this work. And that's what I hope I did, especially in the first part of the 12 years I spent homeless.
And you did humanize the existence of what the reality is like. One question, did your mom have extended family? Was there anybody who could, in your extended family, her parents, her siblings, father, anybody who could have stepped in and did or did not?
Yeah. So my mom was like a hurricane, slow moving but destructive. And so you usually hid and locked things down or relocated to avoid death and destruction. So there were members of the family, and I do not hold a grudge against them. Obviously, I wish they had intervened, but it was simply the case that my mom was just a very destructive force. I tell the story in the book where we were homeless and we made our way to what turned out to be my uncle's home. And my uncle had to prioritize his family. He has two children with, I believe, both had disabilities, a wife, and my mom apparently had been there before, unbeknownst to me, and she was not welcome, and neither were we. So he turned us back out onto the street in the middle of winter, which was not atypical. Family systems. I always think about poverty, especially in the early part of the book, as if you're like the person in poverty is like a drowning victim on the side of a lifeboat, and a lifeboat has a few different people in it, and then one of them reaches down and pulls the person out of the water, and the person goes and takes a breath, and then they drop him back in the water, and he's grateful for the breath, but boy, it would have been nice to get into the boat. But don't worry, there's another program who's going to pull you out of the water for a second. So it's just a constant feeling like this for my mom, who just, there was no end to the processes by which she had to pursue to access benefits. And some of it was just Kafkaesque, like you needed an address to apply for rental assistance. We were homeless. Food stamps, and they would warn you about not overeating when we would always run out of food in the middle of the month because there were never enough. So there's these bizarre moments in the system. But then again, I am a child of welfare. I would not be here without our imperfect child welfare, foster care, and poverty reduction systems. So I remind people of that, because if we constantly scream fire in the face of the public, do you know what we have to pay? We have to pay firefighters. The public does not want to run into a burning building. And the reality is, in my lifetime, we've halved the number of kids living in poverty. We could do more. We should do more. But we should also nourish each other, like I said, with the belief in each other that we're doing the work. And we need more of that messaging.
Yeah, we absolutely do. I hope you are finding this conversation as fascinating as I am. As you can tell, I loved both the book and I am enjoying talking with the author immensely. I want you to know that we have other free resources that are available to you. We have 12 free courses that are available through the support of the Jockey Being Family Foundation. Thank you, Jockey Being Family. And the 12 courses are parenting type courses. They're really intended for people who are in the actively parenting. Go to bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/ all one word, JBF support, and check out the variety that is there. I think you will find it inspirational and enjoyable. All right, so you lived mostly homeless for the first 12 years of your life, but part of your mom's mental illness was also extreme abuse, and you never knew how to predict it because she wasn't always that way.
Yeah. I talk about it a lot. Is part of what we had to do was predict the unpredictable, and to the extent we could, mitigate it. My mom's violence was unexpected in terms of the exact moment, but always coming. And it was not just the physical violence; it was the expectation of such that created, I think, lifelong trauma. You know it's going to come. You don't know when it's going to come. And sometimes you can see certain things that would trigger her. And then around us, it was just a community of violence, be it the folks in the shelters or what we saw in the streets, and even violence in a different way. When I was growing up in New York City, it was the AIDS epidemic, and all around us were men dying in the shelters. So there's so many different types of deprivation and violence. It was almost white noise, even though it was painful. It was just what our day to day was.
It was also traumatic. I mean, being exposed, you might not have recognized it as a child because it was your day to day, but it had to be. I mean, as an adult, looking back and knowing that there was that much violence and death and everything in do you perceive that as a trauma?
It's interesting. I'm not trained like some folks that might be listening, or my sister is. I'll say it this way. It was normal. A lot of folks, there was no deviation. There was no like, this is atypical. So it was a very intense furnace that made me the steel man that I am. And I reacted to it in a certain way, which I talk about, particularly when I entered foster care, which is I shut down part of my emotional capacity. And so in that, sure, it was absolutely traumatic. And then the violence related to my sexual orientation, immeasurably damaging. So yes, absolutely. But also today, I am my mom's caregiver. I am one of her caregivers. I'm one of her guardians. I have two siblings that are, we're jumping ahead a little bit, but they're wildly successful, healthy, with families and marriages. So absolutely yes. And success doesn't negate that people still operate with trauma. But I think we all take it in and do different things. What I often would do, and how I describe it in my mind, is I would take all these experiences from as early as I can remember, but really when I entered foster care, and I would put them in a clear plastic box, and I'd put them on a shelf. And I could see them. I could see what it was because it was clear. I would write down a description. I'd file it away. I knew where it was intellectually, but I didn't have to feel it. And that's how I got through every single day of just yet another mountain to climb. But in my late 30s, the shelf broke, and I realized that my coping mechanism was profoundly unhealthy. And you call it trauma. It was just it was not the right way to interpret and interact with the world, and yet it survived. It saved me. It helped me survive.
So often, our coping mechanisms were life-saving. They are not necessarily life-affirming as we move on, but without a doubt, it might have saved your life.
Absolutely.
Before we leave some of the poverty, that part of your life, the first 12 years, the poverty and abuse and homelessness, what was school like for you during that? Homeless youth in school, homeless children in school are a real issue, but I think so often they're the tip of the iceberg because they're the ones who are attending school. The vast majority of homeless children don't. But anyway, so what was your ability to go to school?
I really don't remember much school until I was in my early teens. There were periods where we were in school, and those periods were super important, but they were infrequent. But they were places where we were warm or cold or dry, where we were not hit. There were moments of just beautiful kindness expressed in weird and beautiful ways. Like I had a teacher who would slip granola bars in my bag, knowing that we would not eat. I had a school nurse. I remember very distinctly the first time I was treated for lice at school. To my recollection, was one of the first adults to touch me, not in violence or otherwise, just a complete compassion. And I enjoyed her touch. It was so loving. And that was in the context of her, if anyone's ever had lice, that shampoo is not fun. And yet I remember it so warmly, where this adult.
So, and the lice pick, and that's not fun either. And yet you were probably loving the touch.
And it was just a beautiful moment where an adult was tenderly caring for me. And then, my real education was sometimes at the hands of my mom's fists, sometimes at the indifference of the public. Often the lessons were never taught in school books. I learned to read not in school, but because of my mother, and then in public libraries, where I also learned to, wash our clothes and bathe myself in the Wendy's restroom, or how to make tampons for my mom out of toilet paper and paper towel when she needed those. It was one of my jobs. So education is an interesting word. I think it is the transmission of values, ideas, and norms as much as it is information. And I learned a lot on the street, and it has made me successful. It has also been a limiting factor at times because you can't immediately apply the same characteristics and skills. You have to sometimes weaponize them differently. And I've done that through wisdom and age.
So my last question in the section on poverty, homelessness, and abuse, what should adults who encounter or work with homeless children or youth know? What would you want them to know if they were to encounter you when you were a 10-year-old, 8-year-old, 11-year-old, 12-year-old?
I want them to do two things. One, we have to talk about this topic. Outside of our immediate circle, maybe our therapist and our loved one, I don't think enough people involved in the system talk about it to their communities other than the crisis moments. And I think we need to do a lot more dialogue to make it central to our conversation. 8.4 million kids live in abject poverty in this country. And yet, not since 1999 in a presidential debate has anyone said the word child poverty. There are thousands of coal miners who get talked about all the time. But the 8.4 million children don't have a constituency. They don't vote. They don't have political power. The only people we have are the folks like you just asked about, is the people doing the work. And we need these frontline workers to take on yet another task, which is to central this in our conversation. One-on-one, first and foremost, I think you need to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. I always love that, when the plane is going to go down and you have to put your oxygen mask on, put yours first. I think what I see and experience firsthand and through my own advocacy, folks burn out. Really good people burn out. And we need people to stay as they gain experience, not leave. So take care of yourself. Not every single moment is a crisis. And I often only interacted with my workers or people that were involved with me when the proverbial shit was hitting the fan. And I didn't have relationships with these people outside of that context. And because I was a relatively, quote, good kid, I was often just ignored or overlooked or spoken to just before court. So I would say try and work with your folks outside the context of a court date or a crisis to the extent you can.
To the extent you can. I mean, I talked with a worker not long ago, and I think she had like 18 to 20 kids on her caseload. And I'm like, what do we expect? Now let's move into the foster care part, because you're getting there. So eventually, around the age, I think it was the age of 12, it's up to this point you had been protecting your mom, or you had been fearful of child welfare, and your mother had or foster care, and your mother had certainly instilled that fear in you. Your brother you and your sister helped him plot an escape. So he had gotten out, and you made a decision after one horrible event that whatever foster care was, it had to be better than what you were currently living through. And you also, I think, realized that you would be killed if you stayed. That her mental illness was such that you were not going to survive it. So you reported her, which had to be terrifying. And you weren't sure that they were going to take you away, which made it all the more terrifying. But they did. And so your thought, of course, was, okay, finally, I am not going to be abused. I am not going to be homeless. I'm not going to be hungry. But that is not your story. So as much as those of us who train and support foster parents want to believe that there that there are happy endings, and there are, of course, but they're not all. So tell us your foster care story. I think you were 12 when you finally reported, and they finally started believing you.
I entered foster care, and my social worker told me years later that I was the first kid she saw to be excited about being detained. And I was. My mom had nearly killed me again, and which precipitated the last interaction that sent us into the system. And I was initially placed in delinquency facilities due to my sexual orientation, which is no longer the case, but it was the case for me, where as many of your listeners will know, but if the public is listening as well, basically kids are ranked and different placements are able to take different rankings. So if you think of 1 through 10, someone at the scale of 10 might have, physical disabilities that require round the clock care, for instance. Well, I was a queer kid. That was a 10 as well. And so there was very few placements that were qualified. So I ended up in a delinquency facility that was violent. It was an inappropriate placement. I was assaulted quickly and repeatedly. There was very little care there was zero care for the affirmation of my sexual orientation or understanding it. The system diagnosed me through a battery of tests that kids go through as gender identification disorder, which was used at the time to talk about queer kids. And my social worker even said to me, dropping me off, "I'll get you out of here. You don't belong here," which said everything. After a period of time there, I eventually made my way to a foster placement where my brother and sister were. So,
wait, before you do that, let me share this. I did not get this from your book, but I did want to share that I think this is something that we have that we as a community must realize, that youth who identify, or children who identify as LGBTQ plus, are grossly overrepresented in the foster care system. I mean, they're, depending on how what statistics you're going for, what statistics you're reading, approximately 5% of the general population identifies as LGBTQ plus. That's not a firm number, but approximately 30% of the youth in care identify as LGBTQ plus. And not only that, but their placement disruptions are up to 1.5 to 2 times greater. So that I throw that out there because your experience is not unusual. Now, I didn't mean to interrupt, because after you stayed, your caseworker left you at the juvenile detention facility, which was just violent, for a number of months, and then take up the story there.
Yeah, and those stats are super important. And my treatment did not end. That's why the punctuation mark was really what you said. But the foster home I was put into with my brother and sister, blue collar folks in a rural location that had way too many kids and were poorly suited to be foster parents. The home was abusive in many ways. I was kept from school at times to be rented out for labor. They were petty and violent. Multiple kids in a basement.
They withheld food as a form of punishment.
More for me, it was the foster mom in particular thought I was quote unquote mouthy. And so I think one of her tactics to make me less mouthy, and she also said I was obese and girly, which may have been true. The feminine characteristics, I don't know, but fat I was not. And the food thing was really about control. When you're starving, you don't have much energy to do much else, including think. So it was from hunger and starvation as a homeless person because of absence to being in a home with plenty and petty cruelty. And I'll tell more about this home and these others, but when I left, I was so emaciated that it was, part of my recovery to reacquaint myself with food. I stayed there for a bit. My brother and sister again ran away and left me. I have all the love in the world for them. They were children. We were in a violent situation, and they had the ability, because of unique circumstances of a separate school where they went, to sneak away one day, and they did. And I'm glad they did. But I was left in the home after that, even though it was investigated and found to be all the things accused by my brother and sister were true. I was still left there. The emotional, in particular, manipulation and violence just escalated, as did the physical. And the horrible treatment for my sexual orientation was just brutal. And I eventually made my way into the custody of a woman who had been, for a brief moment, my boss at the YMCA as a volunteer. And she was not a foster mom. And she had fought for, I learned later, more than a year with lawyers to try and get me, having seen what I was going through in this home, but was unsuccessful. Well, when I reached my limit in this other home and they had hit me for the last time, I made very clear I was not going to go back there. And I was ultimately allowed to move in with this family who had gone from one child to three in the span of a month. She had just had a child. She had a previous one. And they took me in, and they got an emaciated, emotionally, damaged, to say the least. And to my social worker's credit, she gave them the space. I don't think these folks wanted a high touch social worker. I think Holly, my foster mom, was a trained, youth person who worked at the YMCA in a capacity as such. And my social worker, who I actually love my social worker, but one of them, gave me really good advice about at every step of my way with this family. Holly rebuilt me from rubble, and I did relatively well there. In the book, I only talk about 3 or 4 placements. I had many, many, many others. And the reason I only talk about 3 or 4 is because this is a book for the general public. And, I wanted to give examples, but Holly and Steve ultimately weren't able to care for me for the entire time. I moved out of their custody into a series of other homes. But during that time, I was excelling at school for the first time in my life. I got braces, which were physically very necessary. I had all sorts of long-term issues that were addressed with regards to my health. And I realized during this time that I wanted to do something about foster care. And it was during this early time when I was in Holly and Steve's home that I began to get involved in child advocacy, which included being part of the group that advocated for, and successfully so, got the first state tuition waivers for community colleges in Massachusetts, which then went on to the federal level. And I got more and more involved in this work. I think it's something that foster kids do, which is we look for love and approbation from external actors. And in doing this work, I found myself getting that recognition. So I did more of it, and I loved it too.
This is when you were a teen.
Still in foster care. Ultimately, I went back to Holly and Steve's after a hiatus, and it was fine. They're loving. They're very much in my life. But I realized when I was 16, I had to get out of the system. And it wasn't the most abusive moment of my time in the system. Holly and Steve did not abuse me at all. They loved me. But it was, the whole experience was crushing me. And so I decided to emancipate. And I imperfectly did that by hook and crook a little bit. I don't want to give that away, but they can read the book. And I ended up homeless briefly, and then went on through a grant to study in the north of Spain, which you're like, what? I know, it's bizarre, but I wanted housing, healthcare, and food. And I needed to get out of the state custody because my soul was slowly being extinguished from interviews and bad therapy and court people and a system that kept trying to kill me. And I just wanted to be out of it.
You're not alone, as you know.
No, I know.
Yeah, it's and even though it may not be the most logical, if you think from, well, there's more support, if there's more education, there's more. At some point,
Now
you just
I had to cut ties, and I ended up living in the north of Spain with a wonderful host mother in a rural village in the wine country in the base of the Pyrenees Mountains in a place called La Rioja, or País Vasco. And I didn't speak any Spanish, and she taught me Spanish, and she's a loving mountain Basque woman who took the work that Holly and Steve began and really, because of the way I was in a foreign country, not speaking the language, everyone giving me more patience and love because of it, I was able to accelerate my healing and my reconstruction. She is. I'm still very much in touch with her, Gabriela. And from Spain, I applied to colleges. And it was funny about applying to colleges is I would attach this letter to the applications and be like, as you'll notice, I'm missing half my high school transcript. And as you'll notice, I didn't exactly graduate. And as you'll notice, I don't have $65 to pay. And all of these schools were like, well, if you don't have money. So they sent me back my package to the north of Spain. If you just think about that for a second, and it was for want of the fee, nothing else. And the one of the colleges was a fee, but Vassar admitted me. And their policy was, we'll admit you and then we'll figure out your financial aid and we'll make sure you can come. And that changed my life yet again. Vassar opened up so many doors to me in so many ways. I kept coming back to them with the unique circumstances of foster care. My first semester, I went to buy the books, and the school book lady, I handed her my student ID, the bookstore, and she's like, "Why are you handing me this?" I'm like, "For school books." She's like, "Oh, no, you need your parents' credit card."
In my dreams.
I'm like, yeah, I need my parents a lot. So I constantly ran into these weird moments where I was so angry because they got all this way. Like the first time the dorms closed, I slept in my car until I scraped enough money for a hotel. I had to work all these jobs, which really put a strain on me academically to keep up my GPA for my scholarships, which are a GPA main. And then on top of it, just culturally, what was around me was an incredible level of wealth and privilege that I wanted to belong to, but I absolutely did not belong to. Folks would invite me to sushi. I remember that. I was like, "What the hell is sushi?" And then I'd go, and then I would just be like, "No, I'm full. I'm not hungry." I was starving, but I couldn't afford to contribute. And all the kids would complain about the food in the cafeteria, and I'd be like, in my heart, I'm like, "This is amazing!" So just the casual consumption and the cultural assumptions that folks had were just such an anathema to me that I didn't know how to quickly adapt. I learned to, and I have good friends from college, but it took a minute. And I had people in my life. I had this woman who I met was basically like a pseudo foster parent. She sent me socks and underwear. When I got an internship at the White House during college, she got me an apartment, and it was unfurnished, and it was in a rough part of town, but I would not have been able to go. So there are people in my life that helped me.
How did you meet her? How did she come into your life?
She was a volunteer. When I went down to DC again and again as part of this group that I co-founded called the National Foster Youth Advisory Council. And then later on, I was part of something to stop trying to cure gay kids in care with Child Welfare League and the joint initiative with Lambda Legal. I kept going to DC, and I was so lucky to go through media training many times with the same individual. And she is the woman, she's in the book, her name is Tamar, who became my pseudo-adopted foster parent during college. And even today, she's helping me get press for my book. But at the time, she was a media trainee, she was communications for nonprofits. But there's these individuals like that. And flashing back just for a quick second, there was this church that we slept in when we were homeless, and we met these parishioners there, one of the deacons. When I got to Vassar, I looked him up. I sent him a letter to the church, and I thanked him because they're these angels.
How did you remember? Because you probably were 12, but still, they were an angel. They were a bright shining light. That's how I guess.
There are these moments when you touch that, people call it God or the universe, and generosity at moments kept me alive. And it wasn't just like I was starving. Like, they sent me to summer camp, and there are moments of renewal when you see this thing that could be, and it inspires you and it nourishes your soul to be like, okay, I'm going to get there. When you see it and you're able to live in it. And they put the three of us in summer camp for a week, but it was like the most blissful week of my childhood. And then they always were in my heart. There's a bunch of people like this. And I reached out. I actually sent a letter to a teacher too. I sent a letter to the church addressed to them. They wrote me, and then they started sending me a check at the beginning of each semester for $120 to help me defray the costs. And was that enough? No, it was like 2 textbooks. But was I grateful? To the depth of my soul. And I'm still in touch with them. They're beautiful people. So
what did you say in the letter? I just want you to know that I am here. I am doing well. Thank you. Or what did you say?
I expressed gratitude. I said, I don't know if you remember us. And, they wrote back and they're like, of course we remember you. And it's funny because some people have said to me is like, why didn't they remove you from your mother's custody? They go immediately to the, why didn't you? Why didn't you? And I stopped that because I don't ask people to do what's impossible for them. I ask them to do what they can do, and not what I want them to do, because that's just not realistic. They instead decided this is what they could do. And thank God for it. So I wanted to express my gratitude. I have done that throughout my entire life, even like during college, but ever since then, we don't do enough of that. And I constantly try and do that. And I like to write it. And these folks are still in my life. I mean, not in a big way, but every year we exchange correspondence and holiday greetings and birthday. But that's one of the ways I got through Vassar. I worked jobs, I applied for random scholarships. And then I started working on reform. Like Chafee was one of the first bills I worked on to provide transition age youth resources. But then there were these other things like when you apply for financial aid, you have to prove you don't have parents. On the FAFSA form, how do you prove a negative?
And the truth is you do have a parent. But how do you prove that this parent is incapable, is not supporting you, unless I guess if her parental rights were terminated, but still,
Anyway, so college was an amazing time. I got to do some incredible experiences. It was also a place where I renewed and continued growing. I stayed very much in child welfare reform in all sorts of ways. I sort of came out as I got to get more and more work done on this movement to stop trying to cure gay kids. And then I worked on other things like how do we get the foster youth voice to the table to make better law? How do we stop demonizing the parents so that if they're going to be renewed, most foster kids get put back with their families.
Well, that is the goal of foster care
That's the goal. Yes.
Yeah. And some people would say I don't know. Some people say that there is no perfect answer. Some people say that children are put back into bad situations. On the other hand, we would like to believe that children are going to do better. If we could, the ultimate thing is can we support these families so that they can care for the kids? And of course, as you're well aware now, the big push, and it has been for a while, but certainly after the Family First Act, is to put children with extended family as opposed to unrelated foster care. What are your thoughts on that, out of curiosity, as both an advocate and as a person as a former foster youth? I'm curious.
I've understood that 2/3 of the kids entering foster care are from neglect.
That would be
accurate. Neglect is a euphemism for poverty. So we are, in many respects. So we are.
Or drug abuse, to be honest. Neglect is often sometimes that parents are not capable of parenting because they are suffering from substance abuse disorder. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Correct.
Yeah.
No, it's important. And I'm talking to probably an audience of experts. So I'm glad you clarified. But truthfully, even if it's, let's say, half of that, there is a large number of folks entering the system because of poverty.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
Drug use sometimes is related.
Absolutely.
But even aside from the drug use part, if we can remove some of the pressure on the system by perhaps supporting the parents by not taking away their kid, we can remove the pressure on the system to focus on the kids that do need to be in it for serious reasons. I also am often deeply concerned at the condition of the way that kids are constantly subject to the whims of their parents' compliance. So,
what do you mean? Explain that. I understand what you mean, but I want you to explain it.
Sure. Yeah. Often I felt like whether or not my mom was compliant with the plan that she often seemed to just deviate from all the time, year after year after year, would determine the course of my life. And 6 months in the life of a 12-year-old is a substantial part of their life. So the older I got, the more chances my mom had, the more I was like, what is going on? So I do think there is an appropriate tendency to covet the power of the state to break up families. And I think we should be judicious and also acknowledge we're removing kids for poverty reasons, and we should not do that, which would relieve it. Concurrent to all that, for the kids in the system, they're not property. And I feel like our body of law treats children as the property of their parents. And it is threaded throughout. People talk about the best interest of the child, but they're often not what is determinative in the courtroom. It's the parents' rights to the child or the parents' compliance with X.
Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, and yet we, as you say, we don't want to be removing children, and we know that poverty often is that neglect is often shrouded in poverty, or that the two are connected, and so we don't want to. So should we be removing? It's so hard, but you're spot on that from the child's perspective, particularly in a case with and your case was not at all well, maybe it was unusual, I don't know, but In your case, your mother wasn't going to be able to. She had
No,
a mental illness that was never going to. Were her parental rights ever terminated?
they were not.
That's interesting.
There's movements at various times. I think each case is unique, but the overall status of what do I think? I think we are coming to terms with the fact that kids are better off with their families. However, that's in part because we've underfunded the system to the point where we're like, look, it's so terrible. It's terrible because social workers should have 4 kids, period.
Yeah.
They should have 4 kids. They should earn a base salary of $150,000. I don't care where they live. They should get free taxes.
Okay, right now the entire audience is standing up applauding you, and foster parents should be paid,
My afterward, I say foster families should have their kids go to state colleges or any college that accepts federal financial aid, which is all of them, should have to put foster families' biological children for free through school after 5 years of good service.
Okay, you're nominated for sainthood now. Go ahead.
But it's the moral and economic thing to do.
Yeah.
We need to have the best people working in the system. We can pay now or we can pay more later. And the bill later is not just economic. It is the moral reprehensible nature of the fact that we just endlessly pass on poverty through these kids from their parents to them to their grandkids.
Yep.
I say this thing when I talk in speeches.
So true.
More foster kids will become homeless than go to college. More foster kids will die within a year of leaving foster care than go to college.
And sexual traffic. I don't know that stat, but sexual trafficking of children coming out of foster
Especially
care.
girls. Yeah.
And boys, but yeah.
Are we okay with that? If we're not, there's a blueprint in my afterward for how we fix that. And I look at the 4 pillars in my mind, which are social workers and biological families, as well as the kids, and then the public. And we have to address all those things. And there's very low-hanging fruit. People are like, how do we get more foster parents? Why are middle-class people not fostering? Because they're worried about college savings, pension, and healthcare. For example, let's make them federal employees. We need about 10,000. What is 10,000 more workers in this country's federal pension system? We can incentivize people to do it. However, social workers, all these folks like social workers, there's different causes, there's different agents involved. The public just constantly sees the dead baby story and then condemn an entire class of people who are doing this work. And it's not just the financials that I talk about. We have to honor these people as the heroes they are, doing the war on poverty, which we never won. And we're still fighting. And I see people celebrate Veterans Day. I'm like, when is Social Work Day in our country's mind? Never. And yet my sister, a social worker, she every day should be her damn day. I did her taxes one year. I'm like, why are you spending so much money on your kids? And I don't mean her biological, and not every one of them is a saint. I didn't have great ones, but what profession is? But at the end of the day, we need them to be fully supported to do this work. That means, what can we do to ameliorate churn? What can we do to support them emotionally?
And churn is huge,
et cetera.
Churn is huge. And we know that a turnover in a caseworker is significantly correlated to a poor outcome for the children in their care, the children in the caseworkers' caseload, and that's a big deal. People find out about podcasts from other people, i.e. word of mouth. And that is the best way that if you want to help this podcast and nonprofit Creating a Family, the best thing you can do is tell your friends and families about the podcast and why you like it and how you found it. So the podcast is called creatingafamily.org. Let's talk about adoption and foster care. So please let your family and friends know about it so we continue to grow. Thank you. So what words would you give to foster parents as somebody who grew up in the system? What would you want foster parents to know?
So I constantly felt in foster homes, I'm not talking about delinquency facilities or group homes. Look, it's a bit of an arranged marriage, isn't it? And we're thrust into each other's homes with very little consent.
Well, in your case, no consent at all as a child.
Yeah. And even if you're consulted as a kid, often the case is such that there's not enough placements, so you're going to go to this home. So you're receiving someone who is essentially being placed in your home with very little say in that. How would you feel? And then this is probably not your first home, so you carry all this baggage, and then you're in a home that may or may not share your values, however you want to define that, and or have a different religion. I've been converted to every religion in foster care you could possibly imagine, and then you're thrown into a different school, and by the way, that's going to happen a couple times in your life.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the part that also was particularly galling was act like a child. I heard that so often, and and they meant different ways, like go play or go make friends or go this. I had no skill set to do any of those things.
You hadn't been a child.
Ever.
You had been a protector of your mother. You had been holding together of the family. Yeah.
So, and I also experienced things that adults don't experience. I've seen dead bodies. I've been like, the front line of the AIDS epidemic in the New York City in the 80s, living in. So the whole concept of this idea of like flip on a light switch and go be a kid is absurd. And so I don't know what the answer is from a parenting perspective, because each case is so unique. Each kid, each family unit, however we define that, is going to be different. But I would say realize that you're dealing with a imperfect human that does not necessarily have the cognitive capabilities of acting like an adult, but
or
in very
like a child.
many respects.
Yeah.
Exactly. But both at the same time. Yeah. And that inconsistency, that friction is where a lot of pain points come in. Mm-hmm. So permission to do this or that. It's like, oh, we're teaching them discipline. No, it's kind of condescending and dehumanizing. Mm-hmm. So I go from caregiver in my family to, I have to ask permission to go in the fridge, or, these things. You're like, wait a minute, I led my family and everyone's now trying to shoehorn me into this other personality. Mm-hmm. And then at school, it's just this complete culture shock. You're basically going through boot camp all of a sudden, like in Fort Bragg, and you're in boot camp. So I think I'm a foster dad. I know lots of great foster families and foster parents. And I think the practice has changed substantially since I was a kid. But I would say, what would I want them to know? I think one of the hardest parts for me was I couldn't undo the life I had led to that point, and I couldn't forget it or leave it behind. And there was never any space for that in the homes where I was, outside of the therapy room. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what the right answer is in every single situation, but I think in embracing the kid's experience, the young person's experience, would have been very healthy for me.
Why did you become a foster dad?
Oh my God, I never intended to. Everyone always says, not people in the field, but outside the field, oh, that's great. And the underlying thing about that is there's this thing like, oh, well, you were one. Of course you're going to be one.
You know how to do it.
Foster children. Yeah. Foster children do not owe a bill for what was done to them. And I always point that out when people say it to me. I'm like, no. You are as likely and as responsible for being a foster parent as I am.
Yeah.
I push back on that. And the other thing that always bothers me, not that you asked this, but I'll just say this to your folks. I'd love to get people's feedback. People ask me, how long was your son with you? I find it offensive. When my brother and sister had kids, biological children, from the moment they met their child, they were in love. And it didn't matter if it was 6 minutes, 6 months, 6 years, or 16 years. So my son came into my life as a mentee. My sister ran something, I like to think of it as like a kids with high potential, or potentially queer kids, both.
You said he came in as a what?
Mentee.
I thought you said manatee, and I'm going, I'm not even sure what that means. Okay, so I'm sorry. So your sister ran a program for high achieving?
Very informal. She high achieving and or queer. And she basically, kids in her kind of purview, not just on her caseload, but the areas she supervised, she would connect them to me. And I would do a ton a month. And I would basically interview them, kind of figure out what I could do. And I try and connect them to resources or people or programs. And this young man came into my office, and he, in so many respects, was me when I came into Holly's life. I saw intelligence, I saw wit, I saw a lot of pain, and an unbelievable amount of potential. And so mentorship became more and more and more. And at the time I was married, and he just came into our life, and it was very clear, well, at least to me, it was very clear that this was exactly what it needed to be.
Uh-huh.
He's doing great. He went on to go to Berkeley, and he's at Cornell doing a PhD in artificial intelligence. He's got 3 great brothers. They don't live with me, but I'm very close. I love them very much, as happens. Many of your people listening know this scenario, and I've worked with them too, but to a less extent. And my son is the best thing that ever happened to me. He is the love of my life, and is ultimately a big genesis of my ultimate healing of my own childhood trauma. Was because in order to help him, I had to help myself. As I said, you asked me what my advice is for social workers. I needed to take care of myself, and I thought I had, but that was not true. And he demanded that of me, as only children can do.
Yes. I want to thank what I think is probably our longest partnership, our longest sponsor of this podcast, and that's Children's Connection. They are an adoption agency providing services for domestic infant adoption and embryo donation and adoption throughout the U.S. They also provide home study and post-adoption support to families in Texas. And they have believed in our mission as an organization almost from the beginning, and we truly could not do what we have done without their support. Thank you, Children's Connection. So last question, why did you name the book A Place Called Home?
You know, I started the book homeless because for 12 years of my life, I was, and I thought what I wanted was a home. And then I had tens and tens and tens of homes.
Be careful what you wish for.
No, it ultimately was what I realized was my home is not a physical place. My home is the belief that I have lived the life that I have lived. I've been put through what I've been put through, and had the chances and opportunities to make me a tool to apply those to help kids like me, so that kids that come after me do not have this experience, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that is my home. That is my mission. And that is what gives me fire. That is what makes me feel like I'm alive. And that is inside of me. And I realized that in this whole long journey of A Place Called Home, I had it all along.
Well, on that beautiful note, thank you, David Ambrose, author of a memoir called A Place Called Home. Thank you for being with us today. I enjoyed the book immensely. I recommend it. You will finish the book feeling uplifted, and the afterward is worth the book as well. worth the cost just to read the afterward. That's the tease. You got to get the book to do it. All right. Thank you so much, David, for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.